In my last video, we talked about the front side of this assignment 8.3. Now we're going to go ahead and talk about the back side. So you should have finished the front side, and now we're ready for the back. Notice problem 5 says, what percent of test takers scored below, we want to go below, each ACT score. So notice the first score we asked about is 23. And in order to figure out what percent of students scored below my score of 23, I first have to get my z-score, or I have to figure out how many standard deviations my score is from the mean. But remember, we did that in our last video. Right here we had a score of 23, and we said the z-score was 0.38. So first I need to know that the z-score is 0.38. Once I know that, to figure out my percentage, I'm going to need a z-table. Now you should have downloaded the z-table from Canvas, and if you look at it, it's going to look something like this. Notice the first page we have negatives, and the second page we have positives. So we're going to start out by looking at our z column, which is this column right here. And we want to find our z-score, which remember was 0.38. Well, since this is a positive z-score, it's not going to be here on the negative side. It's going to be on the positive side. So I turn to the second page, which looks like this, and remember we're looking for 0.38. So first I have to find 0.3. So I look on my z column for 0.3. Here it is. Then I'm going to go across until I get to the 8. So here's 0.30. Here's 0.31, 0.32, and so on. We want 0.38. So here's the 0.8, and if I follow that down, then I notice that I get this number right here, 0.6480. That tells me if I bounce that decimal over twice, that 64.80% of students got a score lower than 23 on the ACT. So we can go ahead and write that down, that 64.80% of students got a score below 23 when they took this ACT. So you can go ahead and do that for the rest of problem 5. And once we have that, then we're also ready to look at problem 6. So notice on problem 6, we want to know what percent of test takers scored above each ACT score. Well, if about 64.8% of students scored below my score of 23, and I want to know what percent scored above, we'll take the 100% of students who took the test and subtract the answer we got a moment ago, the 64.80% of students who scored below our score. So if I type that into my calculator, I have my 100% of students minus the 64.80% that scored below, and I get that 35.2% of students got a score above my ACT score. So once you know that, you should now be able to finish problem 6. Look really quickly at problem 7. What percent of test takers scored in between 22 and 30? Now, if you think about the picture we drew on the front page, we know that the mean was here in the middle at 21. 22 is going to be just barely above it. So 22 will be right about here, and 30 is going to be right about here. And we would like to know what percent of students scored in between those. So to do that, I'm first going to have to find a z-score for 22 and a z-score for 30. So I'm going to start with the 22. I take my score of 22, subtract off the mean, which remember the mean was 21, and divide that by the standard deviation, which was 5.2. So if I type that into my calculator, I have 22 minus 21 divided by 5.2. And my calculator says that it is 0.19. So I write down 0.19. That's the z-score if I got a 22 on the ACT. Now I'm going to do it again for a z-score of 30. So I take my score of 30, subtract off the average or the mean, which was 21, and divide that by the standard deviation, which is 5.2. So in my calculator, I'm going to type 30 minus 21 divided by 5.2, and my calculator says it's 1.73. So I know that if I have a score of 30 on the ACT, my z-score is 1.73. Now that I have that, I'm going to go ahead and figure out what percent of test takers scored below each of these scores. So let's start again with my score of 22, which, remember, my z-score is 0.19. So I'm going to look up 0.19 on my z-score table. So here's 0.1, and if I follow that over, here is 0.19. And I can see then that 57.53% of students got a score below my 22. So I'm going to write that down. 57.53% of students got a score below 22. Now I'm going to do the same thing for my z-score of 1.73. So I go back to my z-table, and this time I'm looking for a z-score of 1.73. So first I find my 1.7, which is right here, and I follow it across to the 3 column, and I get 0.9582. In other words, 95.82% of students got a score below my 30. So I'm going to go back and write that down. That 95.82% of students scored below 30. So if 95.82% of students got a score below 30 and 57.53% of students got a score below 22, what I really want to know is what is this percentage that's in between them. So if I want to know what the number is in between, all I have to do now is subtract. So I have the 95.82, and I'm going to subtract 57.53, and if I type that in my calculator, I have 95.82 minus, I forgot, 57.53, and my calculator says it's 38.29. So then I know that 38.29% of students got a score that was in between the 22 and the 30. Now that you've seen that, you should be able to go ahead and finish this assignment.